This is TWiT.
We recently talked a lot about sort of the Spectre 2 variants and how Intel was abandoning those updates for some of the older processors, either because they would be almost impossible to implement or they felt there was no point. But AMD rolled out the CPU firmware and Windows 10 patches to protect against Spectre exploits this week. And I thought this was interesting. One, because a lot of these are actually being rolled into the motherboard manufacturer, or have to be rolled into the BIOS by the motherboard manufacturer. And Brad Chacos over at PC World very specifically says, cross your fingers that your system will even see the motherboard updates needed to apply AMD's new CPU firmware. You don't download Spectre mitigations directly from Intel or AMD. You need to wait for the maker of your motherboard or pre-built desktop to release new BIOS with the fixes wrapped in. A quick check of a handful of prominent Ryzen X370 motherboards didn't show any April BIOS updates, though Tech Report says it was able to fully patch one of its systems. Patience is key, it seems. So, you know, he goes on to speculate that Ryzen systems will probably see the update. Older systems probably won't. You know, given the I'm not, you know, I'm kind of curious what motherboard manufacturers are currently working on. And I think you and I were talking offline about this or outside of the show at one point, where it's interesting to contemplate when the motherboard manufacturer has 34 different motherboards in a single chipset or small group of chipsets. They really have to prioritize, I think, where they apply their resources to keep all of them patched or updated. Yeah. I think about that a lot when I'm looking at some systems that are a couple years old. But if you go to AMD's website, they've got the security updates. The Spectre mitigation update that came out a couple days ago. And I also think it's kind of funny because some of the early responses was, Spectre meltdown, that's an Intel thing, not us. You know, Microsoft is releasing an operating system update containing variant 2 Spectre mitigations for AMD users running Windows 10 today. Support for these mitigations for AMD processors and Windows Server 2016 is expected to be available following final validation and testing. In addition, microcode updates with our recommended mitigations addressing variant 2 Spectre have been released to our customers and ecosystem partners for AMD processors dating back to the first Bulldozer Core products introduced in 2011. And again, those are going to be based on BIOS updates. So, you know, it's good that you know, I think the majority of stuff has been or will be patched shortly. I feel comfortable saying that.
One of the things that I feel like AMD left out of this discussion that I wish they would not have is the performance side, right? So, yes, right. AMD benefits because you know, meltdown doesn't affect their architecture. AMD believes that Spectre Variant 2 is a near zero threat to their architecture, to be exploited on the architecture. You know, these mitigations, microcode updates come down to making that non-zero, near zero to be actually zero. But, you know, Intel went through the same stuff in terms of releasing microcode updates and stuff. And there was a lot of discussion about performance. And depending on where you looked and what benchmarks and what applications and workloads you were using, that ranged anywhere from 0% effect to, you know, 25, 35% in like storage heavy benchmark type applications, with real world being somewhere in the mid single digit performance deficit would be my guess.
Right.
AMD doesn't mention anything about performance and you know, degradation in their update, nor do they mention a lack of performance degradation in their update, which leaves me a little bit concerned that there is something there to be seen.
No. We didn't mention it. Therefore, it's not going to be detected by end users. They won't notice. Ignore the man behind the curtain.
I just want somebody to say something, right? And I told AMD this when they contacted us about this news release. I was like, okay, I asked them that question, and they said, no, we're not. We're still looking into all of that. And I'm like, well, you can't really have just one side of this story anymore. It's kind of important that you have both portions of it. So we'll see what happens with that. Like you said, within, you know, modern Ryzen parts will probably see this in a 2-week time span or something, 2 weeks to a month. So if nothing else, we'll have the ability to figure it out ourselves, even without some kind of, you know, discussion from AMD. But it would be easier if they set the expectation levels for us.
Remember, if you don't want to deal with bias confirmation and fear, run the benchmark, then upgrade the BIOS, then run the benchmark again.
Yep.
Although you could argue any Windows-based mitigations of those flaws could have already impacted the performance of your system.